Hi, welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video is going to have to do with a topic that Rollo May brought up in The Discovery of Being, and more specifically it's going to have to do with the kind of parallelism that exists between existential thinking on one hand and various Eastern practices on the other. When we were looking at that part of the book, which I think was about 3 videos ago, we noticed that Rollo May described that parallelism in terms of 2 movements within Eastern thinking, Taoism being one and Zen Buddhism being the other. However, I said that actually that parallelism is, I think, much greater than that, and it extends out into the reaches of Buddhism in general and not just Zen Buddhism, and also I would say Hinduism. So I'd like to talk about that parallelism in quite a bit more detail than Rollo May does, and I would like to describe it first in terms of hermeneutics, the hermeneutic element of existential thinking, and then I'd like to describe it also in terms of meditative practice. Okay, so basically this particular video is going to be about explaining hermeneutics to you in more detail than I did previously. Now, the first time you heard about hermeneutics in this series of videos was in your Getting Started video number 1, when I was saying something like existential phenomenology adopts a hermeneutic or interpretive posture with respect to investigating the riddle of existence. That is to say that it involves interpreting everyday experience in order to gain an articulation of the meaning or significance of it with respect to the question of existence. Okay, so hopefully that is a little reminder for you of what you've already heard about, but I'll be talking about hermeneutics in quite a bit more detail this time. But first, before we get into that, let's also remind ourselves of what Rollo May was saying about the parallelism between existential thinking and Eastern thinking, as he calls it. So item number 1 on his list was they're both concerned with ontology, or the study of being, and they both speak the language of being and cast their ideas in terms of being pretty often. Number 2 was they both seek a relation to reality which cuts below the cleavage between subject and object. And here I was using the yin-yang symbol as a way of illustrating that. And of course, you know, that's more or less indicative of a reciprocal type relation between, you know, what might seem to be dichotomous elements of our lives, but more specifically it's with respect to subjectivity and objectivity, the way we're using it here. And number 3 was both would insist that the Western absorption in conquering and gaining power over nature has resulted not only in the estrangement of man from nature, but also indirectly in the estrangement of man from himself. Okay, so that's your reminder of what Rollo May was saying. So I think that the hermeneutic element of existential phenomenology would actually provide a pretty significant 4th point of parallel or intersection, however. So now the thing you have to know is a little bit more about hermeneutics in order to understand this. So hermeneutics, the way it's talked about with respect to existential phenomenology, has to do with an interplay between 2 layers or levels of meaning. Okay, so one of those layers or levels of meaning, and this one's going to be perhaps a little bit counterintuitive, has to do with everyday experience before we reflect upon it, before we become curious about it and engage in some kind of reflective activity designed to try to illuminate the significance or meaning of it. So the idea here is that everyday experience is already something meaningful. Okay, and what's counterintuitive about that is usually when we think of meaning, we think that, well, for something to be meaningful, you have to be aware of it thematically as a meaning. And the idea here is that that's not actually the case. Like, in fact, most of the time in your life, probably you're not trying to sort of fathom the meaning of what you're experiencing. Instead, what's going on is you're sort of in your experience and just trying to get through your day or something like that and move from moment to moment. And you're not terribly sort of curious with respect to some kind of deep ontological investigation. Most of the time we're just trying to, you know, get done our day and all of that kind of stuff. Well, that from this point of view, from this hermeneutic point of view, that's already regarded as meaningful in a sense. So the obvious question is, in what sense? Well, in your notes, what I did was I tried to give you an inroad into that by inviting you to think about how your body moves, okay, in an everyday pre-reflective type of way. So your body probably moves 99.9% of the time in a very coherent, sensible relation to the world of objects that surrounds you. In other words, it's probably relatively rare when you have a completely sort of random relation, like smashing into things and falling down and not knowing which way is up and so on and so forth. I suppose it depends on what kind of parties you go to, but 99.9% of the time you're moving in a more or less coherent relation to the world that you inhabit. Even I'm doing it here. You know, it's like, notice how my chair is shifting back and forth and how my hands are sort of gesticulating in rhythm with what I'm saying and all of that. Well, you know, it's not as though I'm normally aware of that, although I am right now, but because I'm making an example out of it. But most of the time, you know, you're not aware of all of these, how your body is moving in a sensible, coherent relation to the world. Well, in a way, that's a kind of meaning. How so? Because it's not just random. There is a kind of sensibility to it. There is a kind of significance to how even your body is moving, even if you're not thinking that it's terribly meaningful. In a way, it is meaningful. You're living out a meaningful relation to the world context in which you find yourself at kind of a bare, primitive, corporeal level. All right? So, all right, now let's attach a little bit of vocabulary to that. This is technical vocabulary you'll find in different places, and I kind of used one of the words already, pre-reflective. Okay, pre-reflective means before you start reflecting upon something, all right, and intellectualizing about it or having some kind of insight that you're consciously aware of into it. Most of the time, this is how we're moving in the world, okay? Most of the time, we're not thinking, what is the deep meaning of what I'm experiencing right now? That's a relatively rare thing. And some people, it hardly ever happens that they ever wonder about the meaning of what they're experiencing. But even for those of us who do value that kind of activity, it's relatively rare. Most of the time, we're just moving pre-reflectively through our lives. Okay, the second vocabulary word that is more or less going to mean the exact same thing is this short word ontic that's in your notes. Okay, so ontic. And the third one is probably a little bit counterintuitive because it's the word phenomenal. And the reason why I say it's counterintuitive is because we have a regular English word, phenomenal. Okay, this is not the same thing. All right, this use of the word phenomenal is a technical use. So when I ask you about it on the test, you're going to have to know the technical meaning, and it's not easy to infer that from the regular English meaning. Okay, so what the word phenomenal means with respect to this treatment of hermeneutics is it's that, once again, that layer of everyday pre-reflective meaning that we're in most of the time, at least by dint of how our bodies move with respect to the world. There are other ways in which our everyday lives are meaningful, but that's the one I'm sort of talking about just to help you get past that. Okay, so what you should do in your mind is link up these vocabulary words, pre-reflective, ontic, and phenomenal. Okay, so they're getting at that first layer of meaning. Now the second layer of meaning is the one that is much more intuitive because it's much more in alignment with meaning the way you probably would naturally think about it. So this one has to do with not being pre-reflective but being reflective. In other words, that you're consciously aware of something as meaning. All right, so it's in a sense the sort of coherence or sensibility of our everyday lives insofar as we can realize that and become consciously aware of it. All right, so this is meaning at the level of articulation. You can talk about it, you know, and you can sort of have witty repartee, let's say, with your boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife or whatever you got going on. I don't know, it's the 21st century. You try to be inclusive of everyone. You're cybernetically engineered, polymorphously perverse cyber lover. Let's try to include everyone. Okay, so this is meaning the way you would talk about it or write books about it or in your own mind ruminate about it. Okay, so it's meaning at that level. Now a couple vocabulary words to attach to this. All right, so in the first layer of meaning, we had the word phenomenal. Now we're going to have the word phenomenological. Okay, so phenomenal means at the level of everyday experience before you reflect upon it. Phenomenological means at the level of your conscious awareness of some kind of abstract significance or meaning. Okay, the other word is ontological. So once again, in the first layer of meaning we have the word ontic, and in this layer of meaning we have ontological. Okay, so they're sort of pairs. I think that's an easy way of sorting it out for you. Okay, now here's the trick. All right, so we have these two layers of meaning. These two layers of meaning influence one another in a bidirectional way. And once again, one of these ways is going to be intuitive and one of them may be less intuitive. The first way, let's go with the intuitive one first, is that, well, you know, if you think about it, like anything that you say in that second layer of meaning, in other words, at the phenomenological layer or the ontological layer of meaning or level of meaning, you know, has to in some way, for it to be convincing, be based upon everyday experience. Okay? So where phenomenological insights come from is by way of reflecting upon our everyday experience of life. Okay? So in a way, what we experience in the everyday level is going to influence and shape the kind of realizations we have about the significance of that. Okay, so that's the first one, and that's probably fairly intuitive to you. But maybe the second one, the second part of this bidirectional means it goes both ways, right, is maybe a little less intuitive. So it also turns out that what happens at the phenomenological level of meaning is going to influence what happens at the phenomenal level of everyday experience. Well, why is that? Well, it's because when you have an insight in your life about what you're experiencing, that moment itself is also another moment in your life. Okay? And as a consequence, it can't help but perhaps subtly or perhaps dramatically alter, change, and shift the kind of moments that you have afterwards at the phenomenal layer. All right? So when you have an insight, especially if it's a powerful one, it's bound to influence how you experience your life at the everyday level. Okay? So it turns out that it's not just the case that what happens at the ontic level influences what the realizations you have at the ontological level. Like the realizations you have at the ontological level also, in a weird way, sort of bend back and influence how you experience life in an everyday ontic type of way. Okay, and I'm going to let a little silence happen so you can sort of absorb this. And what this is illustrating is that really what's going on is, here's a way of saying it. Okay, so you start out, you're just experiencing your life in an everyday kind of way. At some point you become curious about it and maybe reflect upon it, and in the course of your reflection and thinking you come to a realization about what is really going on in your everyday way of experiencing the world. Okay, and because that moment is just another moment in your life, that moment of having an insight, it can't help but perhaps dramatically or perhaps not so dramatically shape and influence the moments of everyday experience that come afterwards, which once again sets you up perhaps for another moment of realization a little bit later in your life. What's starting to happen, and hopefully with my hand gestures you're starting to get a sense for it, is a kind of circular activity. Okay, a kind of oscillation, as it were, between these two layers of meaning, between sort of experiencing things in an everyday way, then having realizations about it, and then having those realizations affect how you go back into the world and experience things in an everyday way again, which again sets up another moment of having another, perhaps different realization about things. It's a circular kind of activity. It's oscillating between these two layers of meaning in a bidirectional way, where they're both. It's a two-way street. You getting it? Like, okay, so the pre-reflective level influences the phenomenological level. The phenomenological level influences the pre-reflective level. And notice, by the way, how I'm saying this by using all of your new vocabulary words to help you get used to them a little bit. Okay, so, all right, so let's see, I said that. Okay, and if you think about this, like, it's really, in a way, the deep point of, especially when you think of, like, what's the whole damn purpose of doing something like existential phenomenology, or even phenomenology more generally? Like, what's the whole damn point? Is it just sort of, you know, sort of like twiddling your thumbs and basically doing nothing? And the answer is, well, not really, because the real point of having realizations about the meaning of your existence is actually to change how you experience your existence, okay? And I'm hoping that you find that as something worthwhile, like to sort of deepen your experience of life, intensify and amplify your experience of life to help you get more out of your life. What the hell? I think you can do worse than that, you know? So I think there is a value to doing this. So at first it may seem like, well, it's just like twiddling your thumbs, just like you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs, and maybe you're knitting baskets at the same time. Not really, okay? All right, so, okay, now here's another little trick to understanding hermeneutics. This is another element of the structure of hermeneutics. Okay, so, well, no, before I go into that, the geometric metaphor that people who are into this kind of stuff use for hermeneutic activity is a hermeneutic circle. And if you're into this, you're going to hear that phrase God knows how many thousands of times, I'm sure. The hermeneutic circle. And of course, hopefully by this point you're getting a sense for why it's a circle. Okay, so you experience life, you have insights about life, that puts you back in the world, you have more experience, you have another insight, and round she goes. However, I would say that a better geometric metaphor than a circle would be a helical type structure. What's a helical type structure? Well, actually, it's sort of like a spring, okay? Right, like a slinky. Like, this might be an old school toy, you know. Probably have the slinky game now that you play, you know, on your PlayStation or whatever. I play games on the PlayStation. I'm not putting you down, like I do it all the time too. But a slinky was a kind of toy back in the day that was really just sort of a long, stretchy steel spring, basically, that we were simple people. I'm sorry, we were really simple people back then. Like, we thought that, you know, just having a large steel spring was endlessly entertaining, you know. But at any rate, the thing about a slinky is, if you turn it, it's like a spring, okay? So if you look at a spring from a certain angle, it looks like it's a circle, okay? But if you sort of twist it 90 degrees, you can see that, oh, what looks like a circle from a certain perspective is actually moving, as it were, along the z-axis, the depth axis in mathematics, all right? So hermeneutics only appears to be a circle from a certain perspective. Really, the whole point is to start of doing hermeneutics is to experience that kind of shift along the depth axis of life, all right, the z-axis of life. So you're actually moving in a certain way, even if it just seems from a two-dimensional perspective to be a circular kind of activity. But that's me, okay? When people never talk about the hermeneutic helix or something like that, they always say the hermeneutic circle. But I think if you're really going to understand this, like, I think the helix is a better way of understanding it. Okay, so I wanted to sort of get that in before I moved on to the next little piece. Okay, the next little piece is going to have to do with this question. Well, how is it that you can be sure that if you're doing this hermeneutic type activity, that the insights that you have are not just a way of sort of rehashing how you already understand things in the first place? Okay, so you've sort of rearranged your already existing understanding, and it seems like you're having an insight, but really you're not. Okay, so this next little piece is going to have to do with that question. All right, so how can you be sure that you're not just rehashing your already existing biases and already existing perspectives on things? And there is no definitive answer to that question. There's no definitive answer to that, but there is a kind of corrective, hopefully, built into the structure of hermeneutics that is intended to get around that. Let's put it that way. It's not an absolute solution. So if you're looking for an absolute answer to that question, there isn't one. Okay, so the idea is that sort of circular trap, you know, like a vicious circular trap. It's less likely to happen if you take the time and energy to recognize what are called the four structures of your understanding. In other words, to acknowledge how you're seeing things before you, say, get on this circle or helix of interpretation, right? So if you make some effort to sort of articulate how you're already seeing things, well, maybe that'll help you realize the times when perhaps you are just rehashing your already existing perspectives and differentiate those from the moments when you have a genuinely new insight into things because you've already recognized how you're already seeing things. So hopefully any genuinely new insight can be in contrast to that, at least a little bit. Okay, so the four structures of your understanding. Now, the last point I want to make in this video, which is really a setup for the next video. Okay, this video is really just giving you enough vocabulary to understand the next video. Okay, the whole point of this helical type activity or circular type hermeneutic activity is not to get you to some definite destination. All right, because once again, especially in the Western world, we have trouble with this because we think, well, something has value only insofar as it gets you somewhere, hopefully where you want to be. And that's not how this thing works, all right? So hermeneutics is not about getting you anywhere in particular. So one way of describing that is it's a non-telic activity. Okay, so telic in regular English means oriented toward goals, destination, aims to be achieved somehow. All right, so this hermeneutic circle or helix is a kind of non-telic movement. It's not defined by any particular destination. So the point of engaging in this hermeneutic activity, in other words, this oscillation between these two layers of meaning, hopefully deflecting you along that z-axis so that you have some kind of appreciable insight that actually alters what life feels like to you. Okay, that's the real goal. The point is rather to find yourself on the way. All right, so it's to take up a kind of journey into what your existence is, into what your being is, rather than to you know, sort of get you to the point where you have some kind of final culmination type realization or epiphany or something like that, and then you can stop your interpretive activity and you can, you know, put your feet up on a leather-covered Barca lounger and light up a mentholated Tiparillo and just relax, all right? Like, from this point of view, there's no point like that. So let's see how I said it in your notes. The point is to find yourself, quote, on the way, to take the next step down life's road and to engage its ongoing open-ended adventure with a greater cognizance of its charm, depth, and possibilities. In other words, the truth of existentialism has more to do with entering into a particular kind of process than it does with the specific content of one's assertions or even their correspondence to, quote, reality. Okay, so the point, and this is maybe, you know, a little not what you're used to hearing if you're a student, because, you know, especially if you're in Western culture, because usually the whole point is like, well, you study things in order to get somewhere, and usually the get somewhere is something like ultimately like a good job or something like that. And sort of the thing about this way of thinking about things is there's more to life than getting somewhere. There's more to life than having a good job even, and I know that's bordering on the heretical perhaps for some of you, but the real depth of your life is more about enjoying the journey, okay, and getting something out of the journey, and, you know, living as deeply and powerfully and passionately as you possibly can, given your very limited and unpredictably limited amount of time here on planet Earth. Okay, so that will set us up for applying the stuff that I just told you to the question of the parallelism between what Rollo May calls Eastern thinking on one hand and existential thinking on the other. So have a great day, and I think I might make this next video right now. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.